pass the virtual mic over to our next presenter, Kashika Chawa. And I don't know, is any of your other presenters here?
Yes, Tanishka.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, all right. I will pass it over to you, and she's and her team are going to be talking about the aftershock of choices, mapping the role of ethics during the earthquake relief in India, and showcasing a map to highlight that. So with that, I will pass it over to Kashika and
Tanishka. Okay, hi. Can you guys hear us?
Yes.
Okay. So, disasters are sudden, disruptive events that cause significant harm to human life, property, and essential systems, often overwhelming the capacity of affected communities to respond. But imagine being in a disaster. How will you cope? What kind of decisions will you make for yourself as well as your families? Now think of the people on the other side, the responders, government officials, doctors, volunteers, who have to make decisions not just for themselves, but for a lot of people at once. In those moments, choices are made under stress, uncertainty, and pressure. And these choices, whether intentional or instinctive, carry deep ethical weight. That's where our exploration began, understanding how ethical decision making unfolds during disaster response, especially in contexts like earthquake relief. We wanted to identify where these decisions arise, who make them, and why these sometimes lead to unintended harm. To do that, we started by framing the system. We first mapped out all the stakeholders involved: government agencies, NGOs, local authorities, medical professionals, and affected citizens. This helped reveal the disaster response isn't a linear process. It's a complex network of interdependent actors, each operating under different priorities and pressures. We then analyzed the key characteristics influencing stakeholder behavior by using the stakeholder dimensions tool. It also helped us identify that the constraints and priorities can either be based on their standing or their association. Following that, we conducted a deeper study of stakeholder actions, what each stakeholder actually does before, during, and after a disaster. Yeah. For instance, looking at a government doctor, we traced how their responsibilities shift across phases, from planning and preparedness to emergency triage to post-disaster rehabilitation. Each phase surfaces distinct ethical tensions, like deciding who gets care first or how to balance personal safety with duty. This led us to explore the ethical principles that underpin disaster response. Principles like beneficence, justice, autonomy, and duty of care. But applying these principles in real-world chaos isn't straightforward. We also figured out that different frameworks like humanitarian ethics and military ethics approach decisions differently, which can create moral conflicts in a joint operation. So we began to look at how people actually think in those critical moments. Using a dual thinking model, we explored how rational reasoning interacts with instinctive, emotion-driven responses. That is where decision-making heuristics, the mental shortcuts that come into play. They can save lives, but they can also amplify bias or reduce empathy, leading to ethically questionable outcomes. Through this, the core problem became clearer for us. It's not just about whether individuals want to act ethically, it's about whether the system they're part of enables or obstructs ethical decision making when time, stress, and uncertainty collide. Once we had identified the ethical tensions and mapped out the stakeholders, we moved on to comprehending the system, understanding how all these parts actually interact during the earthquake relief. Next slide. We began by identifying the key actors, those who have a direct influence on relief outcomes, such as government bodies coordinating rescue or local administrators managing logistics. But we noticed that while these actors share a common goal, saving lives and restoring the normalcy, They often operate in silos, guided by different motivations, levels of authority, resource access. This creates a friction and gaps in coordination, especially when time is crucial. We then examine the limitations that hinder the effective relief. Things like delayed information flow, resource mismanagement, or lack of training for ethical decision making. Many of these constraints aren't just operational, they're systemic, deeply rooted in how institutions are structured and how communications flows during crisis. Next, we overlooked at the challenges that influence ethical decisions during relief efforts. For example, limited medical supplies might force a doctor to decide who receives the care first. These aren't individual failures, they're symptoms of a strained system under moral logistical pressure. I'd pass on to Tanishka now.
Yeah. So we also explored the consequences of unethical decision making. These can range from a temporary loss of trust in institutions to long-term psychological and social damage within the affected communities. To understand these human layers better, we also analyze the psychological responses across disaster phases. So as you can see, it ranged from denial and panic during impact to fatigue and grief during recovery. These emotional shifts affect how both victims and responders think, act, often unconsciously. We then developed scenarios to visualize how emotions like fear, guilt, or empathy shape ethical choices under pressure. For instance, a volunteer might prioritize saving a child over an older adult, though not out of logic but instinct. Recognizing these emotional drivers helped us see that ethics in disaster response isn't purely rational. It is deeply emotional and situational. That led us to study the role of emotions in ethical decision making and the effects of stress on performance. We found that stress can narrow perception, making people rely more on heuristics and less on deliberate reasoning. So, understanding emotional states isn't just psychology, it's crucial for improving ethical behavior under crisis. To bring all of this together, we created a Giga map and an influence map as well to visualize how decisions, emotions, and system constraints are intertwined. These maps helped us identify where the system breaks down and, more importantly, where we might intervene to make it more ethically resilient. Yeah. So, with a clear view of the system and its complexities, the next step was to think about how we could intervene, where small changes might have a big ethical impact. We used zip analysis to zoom into specific parts of the system, such as the primary stakeholders, their actions, the limitations they face, and the psychological responses during disaster phases. This helped us identify the problem points, where ethical dilemmas and operational inefficiencies consistently arise, such as conflicts between humanitarian and military frameworks, the pressures of quick decision making, and the biases introduced by decision making heuristics. Simultaneously, we also identified the leverage points, places in the system where small, well-designed intervention could create ripple effects. So the examples are shifting mindsets around ethical decision making under pressure, improving transparency and feedback loops between stakeholders, and lastly, promoting community participation to balance the top-down decisions. So among the various possibilities, we chose to focus on integrating ethical awareness into the preparedness phase. So you may ask, why this intervention? The reason for is this because it's preventive rather than reactive. By equipping responders, volunteers, and even probable victims with ethical understanding before a disaster strikes, we can influence real-time decisions and outcomes. To bring this to life, we propose a public awareness campaign. The goal is simple: make ethics actionable, understandable, and embedded in disaster response. We identified two primary target groups. First ones were the probable victims. These include the families and individuals who may find themselves in crisis, often with little access to guidance or accurate information. The second include disaster responders with volunteers, NGO workers, medical personnel, and first aid responders who are routinely faced with quick high-stakes decisions. To ensure their relevance, we created a few personas as well. So the ultimate goal is a lasting shift in mindset. By embedding ethics into preparedness, we create a culture of fairness, inclusivity, and accountability. Over time, this can influence training programs, NGO protocols, policy design, and how survivors advocate for themselves, building a more resilient, ethically aware society ready to respond when disaster strikes. To finally visualize the complexity of ethics in the disaster response, we created a systems map using Jenga as a metaphor. It captures both the fragility of earthquake response systems and the ethical dilemmas where a single misjudgment can collapse the entire structure. The gaps between the blocks symbolize faults, biases, and ethical dilemmas that weaken the system. By embedding ethical awareness in preparedness, we strengthen these blocks, making the system more resilient, responsive, and fair. We would like to conclude by saying that disasters are unpredictable, but with systemic thinking and ethical imagination, we can turn chaotic situations into coordinated human responses. Ethics is not a checkbox, it is the lens through which every action should be viewed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you. Wonderful timing. I would say our first two presentations have been fantastic, both in terms of quality, clarity, as well as time. So I recognize this is not a simple task to do, but I just want to say it's very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And for those of you who may have come in late, just recognize we will be taking questions at the end. Victor.
Yeah.
My second question is about Anushka, Nimisha, Purva, and to Kashika, Tanishka, and Vivek. The gigamaps that you made, I'm just curious. I've done system mapping, but I've never done a gigamap. And I sometimes struggle when I'm working as a member of a community or with communities, with them digesting, understanding system maps, which can be quite complex. So I was curious, if your gigamaps, were they just for you all to then move forward and make recommendations or begin to design stuff, or did you also use it as a communication tool to other people, decision makers, stakeholders? I'm curious about the role that it served.
Thank you. So for us, actually, we worked on two separate maps. One was a giga map that was more for us to understand and categorize the information. And then once we had everything together, we converted it into a systems map, which was based on a metaphor. So that is more of a communication tool for not the stakeholders directly, but for the researchers to further understand where what all connects and how things can be categorized and what all impacts the decisions in a critical situation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further